Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Elizabeth Jacobs. I'm the Deputy Director of WorkRise and a Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute. And I'm really delighted to welcome you today to our event, Childcare and the Labor Market Recovery, Defining the Challenge and Exploring Solutions. Before we get started, I want to share just a few housekeeping items, which will likely be familiar to many of you from many Zooms over the last couple of years. Please note we are recording this event. The recording will be available online afterwards. So if you'd like to watch it again or share with your friends, you can do that. All of our participants are muted, but we do encourage you to submit questions or comments in the Q&A box at any time. And please also note that we've turned closed captions on. For accessibility, we've also enabled closed captions and Spanish translation, and you can adjust your settings using the bar at the bottom of your Zoom box. So as we reflect on the labor market recovery over the past 2.5 years, there's much to celebrate. We see job growth remaining strong. Women and men as well have regained many of the jobs they lost in the early days of the pandemic. Workers are quitting, but many of them are upgrading to better jobs rather than dropping out of the labor force entirely. And because the labor market continues to be quite tight, employers are shedding degree requirements, raising wages, and offering new benefits to get workers in the door. But one really significant barrier to a truly equitable and resilient labor market remains, one that predates the pandemic and that, like so many other things, the pandemic made much worse: a lack of reliable and affordable quality childcare that meets the needs of working parents. So as many of you know, the pandemic dealt a devastating blow to the childcare industry, which was already in a fragile state. Indeed, the road to recovery will be quite long. According to the National Women's Law Center, for example, the childcare sector is still missing nearly 1 in 10 jobs that it had before the pandemic. As we'll learn from an esteemed and multidisciplinary group of speakers we've gathered for today's event, when the childcare industry is in crisis, the rest of the labor market is in crisis too. And the struggles parents face in finding affordable quality childcare for their children has implications for their long-term career prospects and their economic mobility. So our first panel will take measure of how childcare challenges have affected labor force participation and parents' decision-making about work. We'll learn how childcare providers have coped with these shocks and how employers' engagement on childcare has evolved in pretty significant ways over the last several years. Our second panel will explore solutions that have the potential to support both the caregiving needs of workers and families and the workforce needs of employers and the economy. So it's my pleasure now to introduce our first panel. Speakers, as I introduce you, you can turn your cameras on. I'll start with Catherine Lim, who's an economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, where she conducts policy relevant research to benefit low and moderate income workers. Her research and policy interests include self-employment, women's labor force participation, and taxation of pass-through businesses. And I can't help but say that also I learned recently that Katie is an Urban alum, so very pleased to welcome Katie. Second, Phil Fisher is a professor at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University and a senior fellow at the Center on the Developing Child based at Harvard University. Philip is the lead investigator on the ongoing Rapid EC project, a national survey on the well-being of households with young children. He'll be sharing from results from the Rapid EC survey today. Welcome, Phil. Third, Claire Waterman is the newly appointed Senior Director of Research at Child Care Aware of America. Claire has more than 15 years of experience leading research and evaluations on early childhood programs and policies that inform decisions of early care and education leaders and policymakers. She has extensive experience in quantitative and qualitative research, policy analysis, and mixed method evaluations. So welcome, Claire. And finally, Cheryl Oldham is the Vice President of Education Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and Senior Vice President of the Education and Workforce Program at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. Welcome, Cheryl, and thank you all for joining us today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Katie to get us started on our presentations.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so as Elizabeth said, I'm Katie Lim. I'm an economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and today I'm going to talk about women, work, and caregiving during the COVID-19 pandemic. So you can go to the next slide. So I just have to say the disclaimer, these views are my own. They don't represent the Federal Reserve. You can go to the next slide. Yep. Okay. So the COVID-19 pandemic represented an unprecedented shock to both labor demand as economic activity was curtailed in the name of public health, as well as labor supply as individuals rethought whether they wanted to work outside the home and had increased caregiving needs. We know from the evidence that women's employment was more affected than men's, particularly in the early months of the pandemic. Their employment declined by more, their unemployment rose by more, and their labor force participation rates declined by more. And this is unique. It's distinct from previous recessions where we generally saw that men's employment was more affected than women's. And talking about women's employment overall is important, but this masks some great variation across different groups of women. So in some work I did with a colleague at the Board of Governors, we studied how the patterns varied based on women's characteristics. You can go to the next slide. So what we did is we looked at women who were working prior to the pandemic, and we looked at whether or not they were in the labor force 1 year later. And so what this is showing you is that when the pandemic hit, that's when all those lines sort of crossed, women of all different racial groups left the labor force, but Black women and Latino women were more likely to leave the labor force than white women. And that persisted throughout the first sort of year of the pandemic. You can go to the next slide. So we also looked at this based on the presence of children in the home. So among women who were working 1 year prior, you can see that women that were living, this is on the left-hand panel, were living with children aged 0 to 5 in their household, had a large decline in their labor force participation, around 5 percentage points. Women with school-aged children in the household had around 3 to 4 percentage point decline in their labor force participation, and women with no children under 13, it was closer to 1 to 2. And we want to contrast this also with what we see among men. So men did have a decline in labor force participation, but you can see there's no such pattern that exists across whether or not they have children in their household. So big differences between men and women and big differences across different groups of women. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this all begs the question of what's the role of childcare in explaining these patterns? So what was different about the COVID-19 recession is that it completely disrupted the caregiving system. So schools and daycares were closed. There was a lot of uncertainty about what was going to be in person, what the quarantine requirements were going to be if people got COVID. And importantly, there was a loss in informal care. So at least before there were vaccinations, it's possible that people didn't feel like it was safe to send their kids to grandparents for care, which is an important source of care for people. So the research suggests that childcare responsibilities really did influence women's labor force and employment decisions. And we know that from a number of different studies, patterns that like the figure I just showed you that suggest that women living with kids were more affected than women living without in terms of their employment and labor force. Go to the next slide. And also the evidence suggests that the effect of children may have exacerbated existing racial and gender inequities. So as I showed you before, that our paper, but also other papers, show that mothers were more affected than fathers in terms of employment. So it looks like they bore a larger share of that burden of increased caregiving needs. And we also see that women of color and lower earning women were more affected, both in terms of overall, they were more likely to have job losses, but the effect of children itself looks, and the increase in childcare needs, looks like it was more disproportionately affected these women. It was harder for these women to maintain employment, say, and meet these childcare needs. You can go to the next slide. So where are we now? Just want to talk about right before the pandemic, labor force participation rates among women with kids was rising, and it was generally thought that we were in this long sustained recovery with a strong economy that was bringing people into the labor force, and then the pandemic hit. And so today, labor force participation rates, they've recovered a lot, as Elizabeth said, but they remain about 1 percentage point lower than pre-pandemic. And this isn't the same across different groups. So to date, the labor force participation rates relative to pre-pandemic are particularly lagging among individuals who are not in the labor force, and they say it's because of caregiving, individuals with lower levels of education, as well as older individuals. You can go to the next slide. So where do we go from here? These employment gaps that I've been talking about and labor force breaks have really uncertain effects on women's careers. So we know that taking time out of the labor force and spending time not working has negative earning implications for women's future earnings. But the pandemic era might be different because employers might not view time out in 2020 as a sort of a negative signal. And we've also had a very strong late 2021 and early 2022 labor market. So it's possible that these workers were able to return and not suffer such a large earnings penalty. But I also want to highlight that we might see lasting career effects for women who remained employed because they may have taken leave and they may have pursued hybrid and remote work in ways that might provide new opportunities, which is super exciting, but might also impact their future career progressions. These are things we sort of don't know that I think we're going to have to study in the coming years. But I think the thing that we do know, and the pandemic really highlighted, was the role of access and availability of childcare and schools to support our economy and women's labor force participation. So as we think about having a robust and equitable economic recovery, we're really going to have to grapple with this important institution and how to support it, I guess. And I think the other speakers are going to speak a lot more about this. So thank you. That's all I have. I'll turn it over to Phil Fisher.
All right, thank you, Katie. Really interesting data that you're presenting. And I just want to say as a starter that one of the things that researchers always look for is when findings that are reported in one place are replicated elsewhere. And indeed, a lot of the data that I'll be presenting is really echoing what Katie presented. So I have data from a national survey of households with children aged 5 and under that we began in the early days of the pandemic. It's a large national sample, over 1,000 households every time the survey goes out. And then we've also been doing a parallel survey of the early childhood care and education workforce that began in 2021. So let's look at some of our data, again, that sort of echoes some of what Katie found. So can you move to the next slide, please? So first of all, in our sample, in February of 2022, we asked women in our sample whether they had either been forced to leave the workforce or to reduce their hours. And you can see that overall, 39% of households with women, with children aged 5 and under reported that they'd left or reduced hours in the prior year. And you can see that about a third of those were those who reduced hours, and 2/3, and about a third were those who left altogether. This was actually an increase. So I think in terms of the kind of recovery and where we're at in terms of the pandemic, that it's important to show that with our data, that circumstances for women in the workforce may not be improving kind of overall as other things, including the addition of jobs to the economy, seem to be happening. Next slide, please. I think one of the things that's really critical about the data that we have is that it's not simply that people who can afford to make these changes have been doing so. In fact, the vast majority of women in our sample, when asked if they could afford these changes, said that they couldn't. 83% said that they couldn't afford to stop working. 67% said that it was a burden to reduce their hours. There's another piece of data in this that I think is equally critical, which is that even amongst the women who said that they could afford to reduce their work or stop working, those who did so, when we look at our measure of emotional distress, which is a composite of anxiety, depression, stress, and loneliness, we find that among women who could afford to stop working and did so, or afford to reduce hours and did so, there was more distress than those who could afford to do these things and didn't do so. And I think it points to the importance of work to many women in the workforce, even while raising children and being critical members of their family. Next slide, please. This is just an indication of some of the trends that we're seeing, and again, tied to some of the issues around availability of childcare. So in our 2021 data, so a year before the data I just reported, we looked at amongst those who left or reduced work, what the reasons were for doing so. That is, did they do so of their own volition, or did they do so because they were either had hours cut or were laid off or fired by their employers? And you can see that in 2021, 65% it was self-initiated, whether they left or reduced the workforce. If you could just hit the next return. And 35%, it was employers who initiated this, either by laying people off or reducing hours. In the past year, when we looked at what's happened, go ahead and hit the button again. You can see that the numbers that are self-initiated jumped from 65% to 93%, whereas, go ahead and hit the button one more time, only 7% was employer initiated. So I think, again, this speaks to some of what Katie was saying, that in the context of kind of the initial shock of the pandemic, when there were a lot of shutdowns, including at work, that there were perhaps more employer initiated things that were driving participation in the workforce. But what we see in the last year is that this is really coming from families who are experiencing issues with childcare. Next slide, please. These are just a bunch of quotes from parents, and I'll just read a couple of them. Our survey includes open-ended questions, and you can see really writ large in some of these comments the challenges around working and having childcare. So one parent in Utah said, "I'm concerned about getting terminated for missing work due to not having childcare." Another parent in California said, my daughter comes with me to work because we cannot afford childcare or for me to not work. But as she's getting into toddlerhood, this is increasingly interfering with my work and everyone is aware of it. I'm worried about the future of my job. Many, many more comments like this about the challenges that women in particular have been experiencing, dealing with a kind of combination of finding childcare, providing care for their children at home, and working. Okay, last slide, please. And just hit return one more time. The other thing that we've done in our provider survey is to really document how the workforce, the childcare workforce, has been affected by a lot of these issues. And childcare, as many of you I'm sure know, was not in great shape kind of at a national level before the pandemic. It's only gotten worse across time. This slide just shows the proportion of providers in our national sample that report at least one area where they can't pay for basic needs, be that food or housing or utilities, healthcare, other kinds of basic essentials. And you can see that as many as 1 in 3 providers in our survey says that they're experiencing at least one form of material hardship, and this is clearly impacting well-being. So I'll stop there, but I just want to note that there's this tremendous intersectionality between the challenges that the early childhood workforce is facing and the broken nature of that market, and how that's affecting parents, and in particular women's ability to work and provide income for their families at the same time. Thank you, and I will pass the baton to Claire now.
Great, thank you so much, Phil. And I think that's a perfect lead in to what I'll be presenting on. Today, I just want to discuss really briefly the challenges that we continue to face in our fields of the field of childcare, some solutions that we're seeing to those challenges, and the essential role of childcare resource and referral agencies that can play in the childcare system. And so in February of 2022, we released our report demanding change, repairing our childcare system, which outlines how the US childcare system has changed since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So as Elizabeth and Katie and Phil, I mean, I think everyone has already discussed how we already had a broken childcare system, but the COVID-19 pandemic really highlighted some of those inequities, and that we really needed to make some serious, changes to the system. Next slide, please. So this report that I'll be presenting on some of the findings, we have a section on supply, demand, affordability, and the childcare workforce. And so I'm going to go pretty quickly through the slides, but as I think has been mentioned in the chat, the slides will be available. So all of the data you see here are available in the slides, as well as you can go to the report as well. But what we found was that many programs have closed, and these are likely to be permanent closures. So our annual survey results showed that a total of 8,889 childcare centers closed in the 37 states for which we had data. And in that same period, 6,957 licensed family childcare programs or home-based programs closed in 36 states. So these actually permanent closures represent a 9% loss in licensed centers and a 10% loss in family child care programs. And as has been mentioned previously by Katie and a bit by Phil, that these closures most likely are not equitable closures, or they don't impact families equitably, right? So a lot of those inequities that we're seeing are also probably being exacerbated by the closures of these childcare programs. Next slide, please. Thank you. So inadequate childcare and childcare disruptions create very real losses in families' earning power. So that's what this slide really covers, as well as to the overall economy. So childcare breakdowns cost businesses $16 billion annually and has an impact on the overall economy of $25 billion per year. And as has been discussed previously, this disproportionately affects women, disproportionately affects women of color, and the slower economic growth due to fewer people in the workforce. Next slide, please. So what we also found related to affordability was that there was a pronounced jump in the price of childcare that occurred during 2020, during the early months of the pandemic. And so what we see is that in 2019, childcare prices exceeded the inflation rate by only about 0.12%. However, in 2020, these prices exceeded the annual inflation rate by nearly 4%. And so we posit that this is likely due to several variables associated with the pandemic. So, for example, the need to purchase, equipment, safety equipment, but also staffing shortages, as well as reduced ratios due to laws and regulations related to the pandemic. So we can see here that while childcare has always been not affordable, that we're seeing that it's increasing at a larger rate than inflation. Next slide, please. So childcare continues, as I already mentioned, to be unaffordable and inaccessible for families, particularly as it consumes a large portion of their income. So in 2020, the national annual average price of childcare was $9,800 to $10,200. And in 3 out of 4 regions of the US, the annual price of center-based childcare for an infant exceeds the cost of housing. And in all 4 regions, it exceeds the annual cost of in-state tuition for a public 4-year university. So we can see that childcare really takes up a large proportion of families' income. Next slide, please. So I think that Katie spoke a bit to the recovery of the workforce, but what we are finding is that the childcare workforce has only recovered to 84% of pre-pandemic levels. And even before pandemic-related closures of programs, the supply of childcare was decreasing. This probably has many reasons, but the median wage for childcare workers in 2020 was $12.24 per hour, which of course is really not a living wage in today's society. And many don't have employer-provided health insurance or other benefits, which undermines their ability to provide high-quality care while also providing for the needs of their families. As Phil mentioned, many are not able to provide for their families in key areas that are important. So undervaluing the work of childcare providers highlights the deep historical inequities, as nearly all childcare workers are women and 40% are women of color. Next slide, please. So what are we going to do about it? Pandemic relief. So the stabilization funds have really been a lifeline for families and childcare providers, as well as communities. States have been doing a lot of great support of childcare providers through the ARP funds, as well as kind of weaving together with the previous packages. States are not, each state is doing their own thing, but they're really doing things like expanding subsidy eligibility thresholds for families, providing bonuses to childcare providers. And so this, the pandemic relief has provided a really good opportunity to see what can happen when we do actually invest large public dollars in the childcare system. The next slide, please. This will be my last slide. So overall, we found that states are leveraging the flexible funds, like I said, in different ways. And during the course of the pandemic, the states have relied very heavily on childcare resource and referral agencies, so CCR&Rs, to meet the needs of children and families, and really have deepened those relationships over the past couple of years. And policymakers have recognized that the CCR&Rs are essential for the field, as they're able to connect with families, they're trusted by families, and they can connect families to their needed to childcare that meets their needs. And so really amplifying those voices and continuing the deep partnership work with CCR&Rs can be a way for us to really build the workforce. So with that, I know that was very quick, but with that, I will pass it off to Cheryl.
Thanks, Claire. And first, I just want to say thanks so much for having me here. I'm thrilled to be here with Katie and Claire and Phil. And again, I'm Cheryl Oldham. I represent the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Chamber Foundation. And just, I guess, quickly to say, for those who might not be aware, the Chamber is the largest association representing the interests of business in the world. And so that's sort of where I'm coming from these remarks, but you can go to the first slide. What I'll talk about really quickly is just a bit about the business community's engagement on childcare and how it's grown and evolved, particularly through the pandemic. Secondly, a bit around some work we've done related to long-term implications of childcare on the economy, and then finally cost to employers specifically. Next slide. We got into this business probably about 5 years ago at the Chamber Foundation, and it really was, I'll admit, I think at the time was more of a focus from our perspective on childcare as a really important educational foundation for children to be successful as they move on into K through 12 and beyond. And while that is still critically important, I think the emphasis might have shifted over the last couple of years throughout the pandemic. But the work that the research that we did about 5 years ago, and you can see it here, Workforce of Today, Workforce of Tomorrow, was a report that we did in partnership with the American Enterprise Institute. And we really talked about the importance of childcare as a two-generation issue, really critical, as I said, educational foundation for the workforce of tomorrow, but obviously a really important work support for the current workforce. And we were really trying to make the business case for employer engagement and sort of interest in childcare. And it wasn't a hard case to make, but I will say that the interest has really grown since the pandemic. We certainly were able to make the case, and we were, having a lot of success sort of pre-pandemic, helping to bring both chambers across the country and their member companies into this conversation, helping them understand why it's so important to their workforce. But the pandemic really sort of put that on steroids. Let's go to the next slide. We did some work. We started this work in 2020. We did some research to really dig into the cost to both state economies and to employers when childcare breaks down. And we, pre-pandemic, did that work in 4 states. And then post-pandemic, or during the pandemic, we did it in 5 more states that are referenced here: Arkansas, Alaska, Arizona, Missouri, and Texas. And Claire referenced, cost to employers and to the economy writ large when childcare breaks down. I think our numbers suggest it's even bigger than what Claire's research said. I mean, in Texas alone, the state loses about 10 billion annually when childcare breaks down. And it's anywhere from, some states in the hundreds of millions all the way up to Texas at 10 billion. We also saw, some of the other information here, 28 to 40% of parents reported that they or someone in their household has left a job, not taken a job, or changed jobs because of their childcare situation over the last year. And back, sort of in the first year of the pandemic, we saw this real, and this was, I think, referenced by maybe by all three of my panelists, the sort of unevenness with men and women. So 77% of men had already returned to work in October of 2020 in that first year of the pandemic, compared to just 54% of women. And then there's this other data point that really gets me. This was earlier this year. So 2022, we're in this, situation with a pretty clear worker shortage. And that first labor market sort of report that came out in January of 2022 that said 1 million men had re-entered the labor force compared to 39,000 women. And it's not to say that childcare is, the only reason, but it's got to be a really, based on everyone's research here, but that was really, really sort of jaw dropping, I think. Next slide, and I'll be quick to wrap it up. We did some surveying of employers specifically, and here are some highlights about 66% of employers expressed a willingness to increase childcare supports. So this is as we're sort of into the second end of the second year of the pandemic. Over 60% cited childcare as a factor for why they're seeing their employees leave the workforce. And then let's just go to the next slide and I'll wrap it up. So we really wanted to help. The employers want to do more for their working parents. They have told us this. We hear it all the time. And so this is just a visual of a sort of a toolkit that we've produced for the employer community, but it shows you kind of an array of ways in which the business community can help working parents. And it's not just on-site care, right? Like that is not an option for the vast, vast majority of employers in the United States. And so, but there's a whole host of things that employers can do to support their working parents, and they want to do that and are doing it increasingly more and more. I'll stop there, and then hopefully we can get into a little bit more of the specifics of what employers are doing in the Q&A section. Thanks.
Thank you all. That was a really great grounding in the problem and some hints maybe at solutions, so that we'll have lots more time to talk about that in the next panel. So I thought I'd start out with a question for the group, and I'm going to ask each of you to take a shot at answering it, because I think you'll have slightly different perspectives. So we know that families across the income spectrum struggle with childcare. I can say that personally I do, and I'm certainly not representative of the entire workforce. I have a weird think tank job. But affordability and accessibility issues are obviously particularly acute for parents in low-wage jobs, especially those working non-traditional hours, which we know overlaps substantially with low-wage work. So I would love to hear from each of you a little bit about how you think we should be addressing the childcare challenges for low-wage workers in particular. And if you're a researcher thinking about frameworks for thinking about the problems, feel free to sort of lay out the specifics of what you think we ought to think about in the context of low-wage workers in particular. If you want to think about solutions, that's great. So I'll throw it back to you all. And I'll let whoever wants to jump in first jump in, although if you're quiet for too long, I'll call on you. It looks like Cheryl's ready.
I was just going to say, because it sort of leads into how I finished my, one of the things that we tell employers, and they are, and I think this is specifically the case when you're talking about low wage workers, is there's I think one of the most important things employers need to do is understand what the needs of their low wage workers are, or all of their workers. And so doing that surveying of your employees, understanding what their needs are. Oftentimes, and I've had this conversation with a very large employer that has franchises all over the world, and they're trying to address this issue of childcare for their workforce. And I said to them, do you even know what they need? What they need might actually be predictive scheduling. That might be the biggest thing you can do for your workers who, if they don't know what their schedule is from week to week, it's going to be next to impossible to line up childcare. So maybe that's the most important thing you could do for them. Subsidizing maybe could be another one. I mean, there's a whole host of things, but I think understanding what they need and want is a really important first step.
So,
I'll go. I think one of the things that we have been really struck by is the extent to which sort of the general public's concept of what's needed for low-wage workers in the way of childcare may not map onto the actual reality. So, for example, a lot of low-wage work is hourly. It's not necessarily predictable. And it may not map onto the kind of standard hours that center-based care and or federally funded preschool programs exist. That is, it's not a eight to 6 kind of an endeavor. People who do shift work oftentimes have shifts that rotate. So they'll be working graveyard shift, then they'll be working swing shift, then they'll be working daytime. All of those things create additional challenges. And so I think part of the question is, how do we develop a more comprehensive system that makes childcare available in the context of the actual work schedules that low-wage workers experience? It's not just a question of affordability, and it's not just a question of, are there open seats in a particular county or whatever the metric might be in terms of the geographic unit. It's also, is there a fit? And we find consistently that family, friend, and neighbor care and other more informal forms of care are often overlooked in terms of policy discussions. And as a researcher, there's also this predominant narrative that I think has major challenges in terms of racial and economic equity around family-based care being lower quality, which I think is really a sort of an assumption that needs to be challenged and reconceived of. So all of these things and the intersection of all of these things really contribute to what we see as issues that need immediate attention. It's not simply, can we make childcare affordable, but rather so many other aspects of the market that really require attention. And then lastly, I'll say one of the things that we find is that even when people do have adequate care available, and I think the Chamber Foundation may be aware of this already, but employers lose a lot of money in the context of shift workers who have care that's not predictable and reliable. And therefore, even if they have care, they may not be able to show up for work because somebody watches their kid's not available, or their kid can't get to the childcare. And so the kind of patch care that's necessary that could be provided on a limited basis on site actually has a lot of potential to help employers deal with some of the increased costs of having a workforce that includes people who have unreliable and undependable care.
I think I'll jump in. Oh, Katie, did you want to go ahead?
I was just going to ask a follow-up question. I want to jump in with a follow-up because it's directly related, and then I want to be sure, Claire and Katie, that you both get a chance to answer, and you may have the answer to my question. But I'm curious, Phil, I really appreciate you raising the family and kin-based care and the racial equity question there. And I wonder if any of you have numbers at your fingertips in terms of the type of care that folks are most likely to rely on across the income distribution. So we know that people rely on different kinds of care, what the share of low-income kids from low-income families who are in specific care arrangements, how that breaks down. So I think to your point, Phil, that there are real variations across both the income earning spectrum, but also racial differences as well. It would be really interesting to know as we think about kind of equitable and real solutions that meet folks where they are, understanding that would be key. So no one has to answer that. Actually, if you don't have it at your fingertips, feel free to not answer the question, but I'll put it out there as a question for someone to jump onto as we continue to work through folks' reflections. So Claire or Katie, either one of you, someone wants to jump in. Phil, that was a question for you. If you have an answer, feel free to answer it. Otherwise, I'll let Claire or Katie jump in.
Go ahead, Claire and Katie. I mean, there is a lot of available data that suggests that lower-income households and households of color tend to prefer family-based care, family, friend, and neighbor care as over center-based care. And it's one of the challenges around some of the universal pre-K programs that get implemented is that they're often kind of undersubscribed in the very populations where they might be most beneficial because they're not kind of available in the context that people would provide care. But I don't have specific numbers at my fingertips, and I'm sure that either other presenters do or it probably would not be hard to find that kind of information.
Yeah, I don't have specific numbers to that, but I did, because one of the things I wanted to speak to is the non-traditional hours, because we are actually engaged in a secondary data analysis project that relates to non-traditional hours. And so I can say that in the National Survey of Early Care and Education, what we have found in the work that we've been doing is that of providers that provide non-traditional hours care, so we kind of defined that a little bit loosely, but that's really hours outside of kind of the I think we did 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. timeframe. That 10,360 of the providers are actually family childcare homes, whereas only 4,869 are center-based. So we do see that family childcare providers. This is speaking to a national survey data that is of licensed providers. So we don't have family, friends, and neighbors in there, but that predominantly the ones that are providing non-traditional care are family childcare providers. And so, one of the things I think that when we're thinking about where we might be seeing more losses and where we might need to support the workforce more, for folks who are relying on non-traditional hours or have non-traditional hours and are relying more on family childcare providers, that incentivizing or finding ways to increase the supply of family childcare providers, particularly for folks who need kind of the more flexible care that can be provided, is, I think really important. The other thing, and Phil, you were just speaking to quality, and is I think one of the things, we just had a panel at the National Research Conference on Early Childhood that we started talking a bit about kind of how researchers are defining quality and how states are defining quality. How does that relate to what quality really is for families, and especially for families who are seeking non-traditional hours? So again, I'm just kind of speaking a bit to that piece of things. Whereas, what you're looking for in a program or in a provider or a childcare situation for a child who's spending a night somewhere is going to look different, right, than what you're expecting in that traditional, preschool program or whatever. So I think that there are a lot of, nuances there. And I think that we've really just kind of focused on like what we've traditionally thought of as what does childcare look like? What does preschool look like? What does, all those things look like? And really kind of being more flexible and thinking about that. I do want to mention that Vermont does actually have family childcare providers that provide pre-K in their mixed delivery system. I just wanted to mention that. But so there are states that we can look to in thinking about how can we implement some of these other programs in a more flexible way that allows families to have some of that flexibility that they might need. But I'll stop there to give Katie some time.
I think I have a little bit of a different perspective, but just thinking about kind of the economics of the childcare industry and how, I know Phil mentioned, we talked a lot about affordability, but I think my perspective, I guess, is that there could be a lot more public support for this, that maybe like public subsidies, public financial support, just because if you think about it as this 2-generational problem, that was brought up in the panel, maybe we're not incorporating the benefits of investment in young children, because we think about public school, how much we fund that. We think about college, how much that's funded, and we give, tax preferred savings accounts for people to save during the life of their child. And childcare is really different. I mean, you have a kid and then you have to pay this large bill if you want to send them to, a center-based care. I think quality is really important along that dimension. So I think, public subsidization of high quality care. And I think the other panelists have talked about the flexibility of what that care looks like. I would think it would make sense to think creatively. This is kind of outside the childcare box, but like, do we want everyone to work? Should parents have choice? Should people be subsidized to stay home and take care of their kids and maybe use part-time programs that, are educational that can help them out? And then the last thing I would say that's come up a little bit is this idea of like no on-call shifts. Like I think on-call shifts are pretty bad for low-wage workers, because that's even worse than it's unpredictable, but then you might not even get paid for it if you don't get called in, and you have to kind of think about arranging childcare for that. So those are kind of the thoughts I guess I have on the question. So thanks.
Fabulous. So I have another question for the group, and then I want to be sure to get to audience questions, so I'm not just asking my own, but another one for you all, which I think we've started to talk about now, sort of woven into the conversation, has been the fact that obviously every family is different. Every family makes their own decisions about work and care based on really unique circumstances. We can obviously figure out some broad brush categories, but there's a lot of nuance going on here. And then you layer on top of that systemic racial and gender inequities that make accessing care particularly difficult for Black and Brown communities. So my question is, it's a policy framework question, is childcare something that we should think about in terms of solutions through targeted universalism, or setting a universal goal and then tailoring solutions to the needs of individual populations? And if so, what are some ideas for implementing it? If not, why not? And how should we be thinking about it? So big question, but I know this is something that all of you have given some thought to from your own perspective. So I'll turn it back to you all to jump in with thoughts.
I'll jump in with just a thought, and it's not necessarily, I would look to the others to kind of maybe they're more well informed. But one of the things that I really feel like we need more information on is really a deeper dive into how families are making choices. And because, one of the concerns is that we can build whatever we want to build in terms of a system, but until we really truly understand exactly how families are making choices, I feel like it's not necessarily if you build it, they will come kind of a situation, kind of what Phil, what you were speaking to in terms of sometimes in some of these universal pre-K systems where you have families that aren't necessarily enrolling who you'd want to enroll because perhaps that's not actually meeting their needs. Gets back to the what do families see as quality, what do families see as their needs, and how they want to make these choices. So I think I and others probably have more complete answers to this, but for me, I feel like we need more information before we can think about how do we tailor to those needs. And so that would be just kind of my initial response, but I would leave it to others who might have more information.
I just would echo that, Claire. I think that one of the things that our survey has really done, at least for our team, is to make it clear that design can be based on really eliciting and understanding what the voices of households and of providers are, and that too much design happens and too much policy gets made in the absence of that information. I think even in seeing, the quality of the data that you guys all presented, the longitudinal trends that Katie can show, we're able to do this in ways that don't require massive investments, that don't take years, so that by the time the data are complete, they're already obsolete. And I think we really need to lean into those methods because they create a much more fluid and amenable kind of context for the kind of co-design that we often speak to. But what we end up doing often is running our preconceived notions by advisory groups and asking for their blessing rather than really understanding how to build based on need. So really think that these methods have a place in the whole process. And I just would encourage everybody to think about how they can do it, and how if those of us who have access to these kinds of resources, how we can partner with community-based organizations and policymakers and advocates to make this a reality.
I probably don't have a ton more to add, but I will just say, I think when I think of universality, it usually, I tend to think of restriction in choices. And that is one of the, and maybe that's, not a fair assumption, but it's one of the things that we had discovered in our research is affordability and accessibility are two really, really important things when it comes to childcare, but also flexibility and the ability to have choices and Phil talked about that earlier. And I think I would just echo that. And I think there are ways that we can do this. We can make it more affordable for people. We can expand access, we can make it more accessible, but we can also continue to, not to sort of narrowly build a system that doesn't meet the needs of working parents.
Yeah, I guess I would jump in and just say I echo Cheryl's. This is like economists really like choice, so giving people choice I think is important. I think it also does seem like there could be dual goals here with supporting what families need for their work, but also meeting, the high quality, like kindergarten preparedness, all that for the kids. So like doing those together at the same time, hopefully they're not, in tension, but I think thinking about both those goals would be important.
So we have a really...
Sorry, Elizabeth, can I just add? I mean, I think one of the things that is clear and clearly represented on this panel, and that the kind of design processes that we're kind of advocating for would really help to facilitate, is that what's good for the workforce is good for providers, is good for employers. That all of these, I mean, I think when we think about ways to support childcare, people think about, are we subsidizing a workforce unnecessarily? When we think about making it possible for families to work, we're thinking about entitlements. All of those things kind of crumbled under some of what we saw happen with the Build Back Better plans politically. And I think there's kind of a need for reframing how we think about these issues as being for the benefit of everybody, and not about entitlements, but really about making the system and the economy work, and that it's in everybody's best interest to do so. But we do have to shift away from what somebody put in the chat about very antiquated notions about what childcare is, about who should be doing it, and about what families need in order to thrive in the modern era.
Yeah. So I'll put in a quick plug for WorkRise as an umbrella institution, just because this is such an exciting conversation to have. This is part of why I love hosting conversations like this, is because I'm always listening for research questions from the field. Like, what are things that if we knew, and in particular, if we researched a little bit differently than the way that we've done it in the past, that we might actually like forge a path forward that offers some new and innovative solutions. And what I've heard just in the last few minutes is, I mean, on the one hand, feels like a no-brainer. On the other hand, as you all have been saying, this kind of work doesn't happen all that often, is when you actually start by listening to families, to providers, and then think about actually making systems change and designing, whether it's new systems or changes to an existing system that actually reflect that. So that is music to my ears. And as a research institution and a research funder, I've written down notes, and you will almost certainly see this coming forward and work that WorkRise does as we head into the future, because this is obviously a key space. So getting back to questions, we have a really good question from the audience that I was actually going to ask you all if no one else brought it up. So, we know the labor market is super tight. We know that childcare is typically, as you all, multiple folks have cited, a low-paid space. It is a low-prestige occupation for all kinds of reasons that we can discuss. So how do you propose to attract workers to childcare, given that part of the issue here really is a labor supply issue? how do we attract workers to childcare? How do we arguably transform the industry at a time when all different kinds of businesses, including very much more resourced and prestigious businesses with clearer upward mobility paths, are doing the same kind of work to attract workers and raise compensation? Help solve the puzzle for us. Cheryl, I actually want to put you on the spot first because I'm very curious to hear. I know, I'm sorry, but I'm extra curious to hear from business because I do think there's both thinking about childcare industry as part of the business community, right? Childcare at this point, there are some like big business childcare, but there also are different incentives for employers depending on the nature of their workforce in terms of how invested they might be in actually investing in childcare and the childcare workforce more generally. So I'm going to put you on the spot because I'm curious to hear from an employer perspective, which is not usually where we start when we're talking about these things, which makes it a little more interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, I mean, this is going to be like the wonky. Well, one of the things that came to my mind when we were asking the question was, how do you attract more people to this workforce? I mean, somebody said it, I think Katie said it early on, or maybe it was Claire. I mean, the average pay was $12 an hour for people in the childcare workforce. Well, obviously, if Amazon and McDonald's and everybody else can pay a minimum of 15 to 20, like that, this is economics. People are going to go where they can make more money. So how do we raise the wages in this industry? And I think part of that has to be, because it is such a subsidy heavy industry, that we gotta fix this, the market rate stuff, how we pay for childcare, how we subsidize it, how we figure out what does it really cost, and therefore what are the it seems like there's a lot of work to do. And I know that Build Back Better, that was part of that. It's also, I think, part of the CCDBG reauthorization bill is to really look at this piece. So I think that piece is important. I don't know that this is attracting people. I don't know this next piece actually answers your question, but I will say we have begun to give a lot of thought to how do we really support and elevate the childcare industry as businesses, right? People don't get into this work though to be a business. They don't think about themselves as business owners. They're doing this because they love children. They're not, and so we, I only say this to say that we're just kind of starting this work, which is how do we help our chambers and others to really begin to attract and support those childcare businesses in their communities and bring them into the business community, and help them with shared services and other things that might help them to become, more profitable businesses, because they're, working on low margins before the pandemic, or, next to nothing now. It's really hard to survive.
Thanks.
In terms of thinking of some thoughts that come to mind in terms of like, there's a difference of attracting people and then also keeping people from leaving. And so some of the stuff I've seen places that are doing more mental health focused stuff to kind of improve the conditions of the working conditions, but something also that I think shows potentially a lot of promise, although I have not done a lot of work in this area, is thinking about how can we leverage the career technical ed programming and apprenticeship programs, and and start to attract folks to this field and see this as something that is a profession that can be rewarding, and I do wonder if those are some ways in which we can kind of do that. I mean, I think the K-12 space is also tackling the same issue right now. So there could be actually a lot of synergy there in terms of a lot of the issues are the same, right? Because I contend that education is childcare as well. And I think the pandemic showed that, but, thinking about how do we leverage what's happening in other spaces, and how they're tackling very, very similar conversations and problems, I think could be really, really valuable.
One thing I've been thinking about, that I'm not an expert in the space, but I'm very curious on like the structure of the childcare market. So I do think that it's kind of different to be the for-profit versus the not-for-profit, and just like anecdotally, like we have some Catholic schools that now have, daycare centers kind of in them, and there's a bunch of, I think, cross-subsidization in terms of having like lower ratios in those lower grades, and parents aren't necessarily paying the cost of that fully because it's cross-subsidized either from, the Catholic Church or the other older grades that have bigger class sizes. So I guess I would love to see thoughts about different models that kind of allow for different working conditions, say, because I think the economics of this is really hard. Parents, I don't think, can pay for really low class sizes with really high quality, care. Like, I think it's either going to be more public subsidies or trying to think of sources of income from a different space.
Two more things to add really quickly. One, I don't think it's just the hourly wage that's the issue. It's also the predictability and other kind of working condition issues. So our provider survey showed that the vast majority of providers don't know their schedule more than a week in advance, and many don't know their schedule, work schedule, more than a day or two in advance. Families don't show up, they don't get paid. So the income is unreliable and unstable. Benefits are not great. So I think it's sort of workplace issues in general, not just how much the hourly wage is. There's some really interesting income stabilization pilots that Homegrown has been supporting to see if more stable income makes a difference in terms of well-being in addition to additional support. So that's one thing I would say. And I think in addition that we just need to get more behind the question of what is the incentive structure. So for many home-based providers, it might be that that the ability to own housing, own homes is a big incentive as opposed to sort of educational incentives. And there's some really interesting innovative approaches being done by mission-driven finance to see if home ownership is something that draws people in and keeps them in the game longer, because if you're a home-based provider and you're renting, that you may be evicted by your landlord who doesn't love the idea of you running a childcare in your home. So just things that could be maybe non-traditional in terms of what comes to mind as incentives to kind of grow the workforce, but that if you listen to providers themselves could really be things that help to be transformative.
So I could keep on talking with the four of you like for the next week, I think, because I have so many questions and you all bring such amazing perspectives to the table. But that is unfortunately all the time we have for this panel, and we're going to move on to our next one. But before we go, I just want to thank you all for a really rich discussion, and also ask you to hide your cameras and mute yourselves as we transition over to the next group. So this next panel is going to explore solutions that support the needs of workers, families, and employers, picking up really nicely where we left off. And it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for the next panel, Miriam Calderon. Welcome, Miriam. So Miriam is the Chief Policy Officer at 0 to 3, an institution whose mission is to ensure that all babies and toddlers have a strong start in life. And in this capacity, Miriam leads the development and the implementation of 0 to 3's policy agenda and priorities. She comes to 0 to 3 with more than 2 decades of experience in early childhood policy, program administration and advocacy. And most recently, she served in the Biden-Harris administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Early Learning at the Department of Education. She also served as the Early Learning System Director for the state of Oregon under Governor Kate Brown, and in the Obama administration as an Early Learning Policy Advisor at HHS and at the Domestic Policy Council. So Miriam, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Great job. It is my pleasure to moderate the second panel of our event today. I want to thank all of the speakers. That was a terrific conversation, I think, and set up this next conversation really well. You heard from the previous panel that the challenges of childcare for the workforce is a multi-dimensional one. The lack of reliable care has forced many women, particularly women of color, out of the labor market. Despite the rapid pace of hiring, childcare continues to be a significant factor in workers' decisions about the jobs they will take or whether they can work at all. And the childcare industry itself is at an inflection point. Many providers are still struggling with shortages, but new public investments and greater public sector engagement are hopeful signs that the future might be a bit brighter. So in the spirit of this optimism, I want to invite our next set of speakers to join me on the Zoom to explore solutions to the childcare crisis from diverse vantage points. As I introduce you, I'm going to ask each of you to please share your camera. Gina Adams, a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, is a nationally recognized expert on childcare and early education. Gina's research spans a range of issues and policies affecting the well-being of children and families. Gina directs Urban's low-income working families and kids in context initiatives. Welcome, Gina. Next, we have Mary Ignatius, who is a statewide organizer for Parent Voices, a parent-led grassroots organizing effort fighting to make quality childcare accessible and affordable for all families. Under her tenure, Parent Voices has won the most progressive childcare policies in the nation and protected childcare subsidies for thousands of California families. Welcome, Mary. Next, we have Julie Cashen, a senior fellow and director for Women's Economic Justice at the Century Foundation. Julie brings more than 2 decades of experience and expertise on the issues of work and family, caregiving, economic mobility, and labor in the public and nonprofit sectors. She has helped draft paid sick leave and paid family and medical leave legislation at the state and national levels. Welcome, Julie. Thanks for being here. And finally, we have Nicole Rell, who is the president and CEO of EPIC, or Executives Partnering to Invest in Children, a Colorado-based advocacy and membership organization for business executives who are committed to a future where supporting children and families is a pathway to business success and economic growth. Welcome, Nicole. Now I'm going to ask you, Gina, to come back and kick things off for us.
Thank you so much, Miriam, and hello, everybody. If you could go to my slide, please. So my job today is to talk a little bit about the child care subsidy system and dealing with some of the challenges that we just talked about. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do very briefly is describe the subsidy system. For some of you, it may not be familiar. Then talk some about the characteristics that create both give opportunities and challenges for what it can do to resolve these issues. Next slide, please. So first of all, to understand what the Child Care and Development Fund, or CCDF, is, basically it is the public financing for childcare as the kind of service that we've been talking about today. The first thing to know is that it makes a difference. Subsidizing childcare costs addresses the affordability challenges for those families who are able to get one and find a provider where they can use it. It has been shown to affect employment. It's shown to help families who are in education and training complete their education. It can make a big difference on these issues. It's a federal state program. In 2019, it served almost 1.5 million kids in the average month. Total funding across sources was about $12 billion. Most of the money is spent through vouchers that families can use to purchase care in their communities. It helps defray some or all of the costs. The target group is families with low incomes who have children younger than 13, and I want to stress that. People often think of childcare as just a kid preschool issue. It is very important for school-age families, and that part of the conversation has gotten lost in recent years. And it focuses on families where parents need childcare to work or attend education and training. It is a very devolved system. Feds give states parameters, and there's a lot of state variation. You're going to be hearing some state information in a minute, and some of these things are unique to states. Some of them are true across. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I think is really important, and you've heard it, but I want to frame it slightly differently. Childcare is a very labor-intensive service. It relies very heavily on parent fees. To do it well, you have to have well-paid staff, well-trained staff, good materials, all of these things. But even if we do all those things, it's going to be unaffordable for families. Right now, parent fees are the primary driver of the childcare market. The Child Care and Development Fund only is able to serve 15% of those who are eligible under federal guidelines, which is below 85% of state median income and people who are working in education and training. So it is a small part of this overall market. So while when a family gets it, it can make a big difference in the affordability of the care they can find, it is very hard for that money to leverage changes in supply and quality for the whole market. It's a much bigger market than the Child Care and Development Fund by itself can handle. So I think the first thing to point out is that the financing issue of what we do in terms of public financing to address these issues is pretty small. This is why the Build Back Better proposal for childcare was of such importance to the childcare community, because it was the first time we thought that it was actually going to be enough money to bring up quality in for the whole market, because market ranges from family and neighbor all the way to the fanciest center, right? All of those providers are ones that are helping families meet families' needs. So I think that's the first issue. The other thing to point out is that the funds are all being used. There's not low uptake. It is all being used. I saw a question about that in the chat. It is really a question that there's not enough money to serve everybody. Next slide, please. Some quick challenges. The first and foremost is that the insufficient funding of the program means that every state has to make very hard trade-offs. Biggest one they do is, do you pay very little and serve a lot more kids, or do you pay more and serve fewer kids? Most states set their rates very low, which means that they only allow families to be able to access a certain part of the market, that more expensive programs they can't use the rates for. It also means, for example, that many states will prioritize parents who are employed rather than parents who need childcare to go to school, because they have to make a trade-off. They can't serve both. Second issue is that I think we've not paid enough attention to how the subsidies are delivered. It is a very complex, can be a very complex, burdensome challenge for families to get it. The documentation, those issues are set at the state level often, and there's much we could do to simplify that, which would make a big difference. Third, we've talked a little bit about this already. Subsidies really need to pay for the types of care that families need and want to support work. There's been a real pressure in the system to move towards center-based care in recent years for lots and lots of reasons that are too complicated to go into. Home-based care, ranging from family, friend, and neighbors, as we've talked about, all the way through, play a critical role and serving families at different times of day, families in different communities, families with different kinds of needs. But right now, our system doesn't support that in many, many ways. And some states do, but many states, it's a very small fraction of the overall sector. And family, friend, and neighbor or legally unlicensed care is a big part of the childcare market that we're not supporting. So the three things that I want to flag going forward, one is I think there's really big questions for all of us about what the impact, long-term impact of the pandemic is going to be on childcare market and on changing demand. What happens if a lot of the middle and upper income families are working part-time from home and want to go pick up their kids at 3, when the model needs to have a full day service to be able to pay? What happens if you have a lot more people wanting home-based care that we don't support? A lot of the issues that we're talking about, I think for families, is because it's so uncertain right now. If the childcare program and the school closes every time there's a COVID case, you can't go back to work. Our childcare system is not designed to address that because we don't have something that takes care of children whenever COVID risk, right? So this is a big issue, I think, for women going back to work. You can't take a job if you don't know whether you're going to be able to be there next week because your kid will end up at home. Finally, I think the big uncertainty we're all facing is there's ongoing questions. Will there be greater public investments? Because I'll just say, there's a lot that we could fix with this system if there was money there to fix it. This is a market problem. And unless there's money from some source, it's just not going to get fixed. So I will stop and I will turn it over to Julie. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. Absolutely. And, just to reiterate that, as we're talking about solutions here, most families are not part of Child Care Development Block Grant or Development Fund at all, right? Most families who need childcare are not even eligible for that program or part of that program. And Gina laid out what the problems are for those who are participating, including the childcare programs that are participating. And so I think, we need so much more when we think about solutions, and it's not just childcare. We need so many solutions across the spectrum. Next slide, please. Thank you. So at some point in our lives, every single one of us will either need care or need to be cared for or need to provide care, or both, right? And so this affects everyone. We know more than 33 million families have children under age 18. 2/3 of children from birth through age 12 have all of the available parents in the workforce. 72% of moms with children under 18 are in the workforce. So, childcare is a huge issue for so many families. And as Gina said, not just for the young children, but, after school, before school, non-traditional weekend hours, and summers. We know that 10,000 baby boomers are turning 65 each day and will eventually require long-term care. And I'll go to this last bullet, that 25% of parents are part of the sandwich generation, where they're caring for their aging loved ones and their children. We also know that there are 5.7 million care workers who are caring for more than 60 million adults with disabilities, injury, or illness, as well as the millions of family caregivers. And so this affects so many people, and it's so interconnected. And next slide, please, to talk about the fact that building a robust care infrastructure, which I think of as, exactly what Gina said, that the market isn't solving this. We need a publicly funded system that recognizes care as both an individual and a social responsibility. It has to value the people providing the care and support family members so that they can both care for their family loved ones and provide financially for each other. And building that kind of a system will actually make a huge difference in supporting the economy and economic growth, as well as racial and gender equity and family well-being. So it is a huge issue. When we think about what's included in that care agenda, and I was asked to talk about, beyond child care, in general, I kind of hate laundry lists, like policy laundry lists. They're a little too much, but the reality is we need all the things. And when you talk about needing all the things, when you talk about military, for example, we need the Army, we need the Navy, we need the Air Force, we need the Coast Guard, we need the Marines. No one asks you to choose among them. Right? So it is unfair that we are often asked to choose among all of the family supporting policies that we know are central to economic growth and women's labor force participation. So to start, comprehensive childcare and early learning, as Gina mentioned, the Build Back Better Act would have been really a huge deal, $400 billion at a minimum. It passed the House of Representatives. It would have guaranteed assistance to every eligible family. To me, this is targeted universalism that actually maximized family choices and treated it as a public good, invested in the workforce, and ensured all children had access to high quality care that allowed them to thrive. And I think folks are still fighting for that in terms of what's actually happening in Congress right now. That's not on the table right now, but there is additional money for childcare that could get into the reconciliation bill, and folks are really pushing to make that happen. In addition, paid family and medical leave. This is not something we have on the national level right now. That's paid time to care for newborns, newly adopted children, serious illnesses, seriously ill loved ones. We do not have paid family leave in the United States. The vast majority of workers don't have access to it. We do have 11 states and Washington, D.C. that have adopted it, recognizing the economic, child development, and health benefits of providing folks with the time they need and the resources they need to take that time, but that is not a national policy. Similarly, we don't have paid sick and safe days in the United States. And when you think about the pandemic and what everyone's been through, the fact that people are not guaranteed that they can take time off when they've been exposed to an illness, when they are sick, or when their family members are sick and need them. This is a huge deficiency, but it's also a huge and important solution. Similarly, long-term supports and services that a lot of folks have been talking about as home and community-based services right now, in order to make sure that people with disabilities can live independently, that aging adults have the support they need to age with dignity. The child tax credit, we were able to expand that as part of the COVID relief package, and it reached 61 million children across households. It made a huge difference in cutting child poverty. Similarly, Phil talked a lot about scheduling issues. We have predictability and flexibility that are two sides of the same coin, and there's legislation in Congress and Schedules at Work Act that can make a difference. We need fairness for pregnant workers, and we need access to abortion. A person's ability to decide when, how, and under what circumstances to plan for their family, that makes a huge difference to their ability to be economically secure and stable. Let's go to the next slide quickly. A report that I did with my colleague Amanda Novello We looked at every state and looked at some key policy issues on care, childcare, home and community-based care, paid leave, paid sick days, working conditions for care workers, and then some extra credit like fair scheduling and family supporting tax policies and pregnant worker fairness laws. No state got an A, right? This reminds us, A, we absolutely need the federal government's leadership and resources to be able to help states to do that, because they cannot do it on their own and they're not going to. And B, there's so much more work to do in the states. This doesn't mean state advocates haven't been working so hard to make it happen. They absolutely have. There's so much work to do to build the political power and political will in order to get this done. And so the next slide talks a little bit about the uphill battle we have. We got the American Rescue Plan done. That made a big difference for childcare. We had COVID relief funds that went to paid leave in the emergency that was the pandemic. We have a president who has talked about the need for care and everything that can happen. And yet we still have a Build Back Better bill that is dead. And so there's a lot of work to do. We have made some great progress. And to hear more from one of my favorite leaders working so hard on this, I'm going to turn it over to the fabulous Mary Ignatius.
I was like, who's she talking about? Thank you, Julie. Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Ignatius. I'm the statewide organizer of Parent Voices in California. We center the wisdom and expertise of families to transform childcare and all the systems that impact them to be just, fair, and inclusive for all. And I'm here to give you the perspective of who we listen to, and that's the families who qualify for subsidized childcare and are the closest to the solutions, but oftentimes are the most ignored. But just to level set, my first slide is really just speaks to, sorry, the next slide. I feel like we can't have this conversation unless we just talk about how the system was designed from the beginning. So I'm going to do 400 years of racism in 20 seconds. You know, this country was founded on the backs of free and forced labor of African people. And Black women were forced to nurture and care for their slave owners' children. And that framework has carried through over time. When the slaves were emancipated, you know, the jobs that were available continued to be domestic work. And so they were the nannies, they were the housekeepers. And so then you go to 1938 and the New Deal and the Fair Labor Standards Act, and agricultural workers and domestic workers are still excluded from labor law. And then you move to the 80s and Reaganomics and trickle down policies that didn't work, where they took money from social programs and gave it to tax cuts for the rich. And this welfare queen stereotype continues to permeate our social policy and the way we treat families who are accessing and navigating these services. The welfare queen myth, you know, is that she's typically a Black woman sitting at home waiting for a handout. And in my 17 years of organizing parents who need these services, I'm yet to meet this elusive welfare queen. They are definitely queens, but they are working their butts off. And so when we talk to families about how to improve the system, we ask them, like, which are the ones that give them the most pain, which are the ones that make them struggle to either access the services, or if they get the golden ticket of actually getting a subsidy, what are the things in place that are preventing them from holding on to it? So I'm going to walk through 3 campaigns we've done recently. Next slide, please. The first campaign we worked on was establishing 12-month authorizations for childcare services. On the books, we had 12-month eligibility, but that's really if you worked a 9 to 5 and went to one childcare program and had the same schedule every day. But Typically, for like most families that we've heard about, if you are in a low paid retail, agriculture, janitor, low paid industry, you don't have control of your schedule. It's changing week to week. You are probably going to school at the same time. And so for those families who didn't have predictable schedules, on the books, the law required them to come in every 4 months to recertify, to basically show all of their proof that they continue to qualify for subsidized childcare. So this is Jessica. The red arrow is pointing to a stack of 18 pay stubs that she would have to produce every 4 months to her caseworker from her 3 part-time jobs. So she would have to go talk to her boss, ask them to, get more pay stubs because she couldn't keep track of them. And it was tremendous stress. We also at that time worked on income guidelines because those were not updated every year. And so we found families who were turning down raises, turning down promotions, cutting their hours because they couldn't afford to lose their childcare subsidy. And so we were able to pass legislation that removed the every 4 months requirement and update the income guidelines every year. We followed that up with, for TANF aided families, that they would get 12 months of uninterrupted full-time childcare before they even have to participate in a welfare to work activity. Because before that, they would give you 2 weeks of childcare to go to this orientation, 3 weeks of childcare to go to job club, and you can't find licensed childcare or anyone that will help you. Okay, my time is up. Really quickly, the other 2 slides, we've worked on family fees, which are the contribution families make to having subsidized childcare. That could range from $60 to $600. But if you are a low-income family and you're working paycheck to paycheck, every single dollar counts. Families have been getting on payment plans for electricity, going into high credit card debt, having to leave their homes because they can't afford their rent. And so we've been able to waive these fees last year and this year, and we're hoping to continue it. And then the next slide, somebody brought up targeted universalism. This is an approach we've been using. Although California was the first in the nation to pass paid family leave, the other states that have followed have gotten better, stronger policies than us. And for low-income families who deserve and want to bond with their children, they couldn't afford to take paid family leave at 55% of their income. We were able to increase it to 70%, and right now we're fighting to increase it to 90% of a family's income so that they have the right to bond with their child as well. So I will stop there and pass it on to Nicole. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mary. Well, hello, everyone. It's great to be here today. Thanks for having me. I am Nicole Reel, and I'm with Executives Partnering to Invest in Children, otherwise known as EPIC. And as our name sounds, we're a very action-oriented nonprofit organization. We were founded 13 years ago in Colorado by a group of CEOs and business leaders, as well as some philanthropic leaders who really saw that it was incumbent upon them as business leaders to advocate for early childhood investments and smart policies that supported both the workforce of the future and the workforce of today or the moment in time, to make sure that as the business community, you can build the infrastructure and advance the policies that are needed to make sure that you can attract and retain a great workforce while making sure that you're developing a great workforce for the future. And to give you, next slide, please, to give you just a brief overview of the work that we've been doing. Our work focuses in on 4 primary areas. The first is leadership and education. So we work closely with business-oriented organizations like chambers of commerce, economic development organizations, et cetera. I use the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation data quite often and love the graphics they've developed. So shout out to you, Cheryl, and your team. But we do a lot of education on why early childhood is important. How is this the best return on investment that we can get as we think about supporting children and their future potential and growth, as well as making sure that we are supporting our economy. We put everything into the language of business leaders, talk about it in terms of economic outputs, jobs that are potentially lost or gained as a result of this, what this means for the talent pipeline and hiring and growth and global competitiveness. Of course, we talk about the workforce and the talent pipeline directly with our employers and talk about how they themselves are playing a part and how they can be more family friendly in the policies that they put out for their own employees in their workforce, and also how they can implement and or modify their benefits to really address some of these challenges that their employees have. We also work directly on childcare infrastructure, meaning looking at the facilities, the real estate, the financing, the regulatory structures that we need to pay attention to make sure that our communities at large and our community members have the childcare access and affordability when and how and where they need it. And then lastly, but perhaps most importantly, we also focus on nonpartisan and bipartisan policy work, largely here in Colorado, but also sometimes on the federal level. And we engage our business leaders directly in this work. Oftentimes they will actually, testify on bills. They'll reach out to legislators. They help us craft legislation. And we do a lot of work on this. And business leaders, being highly visible, influential individuals are very effective in the policy realm. So I'm going to highlight a couple of examples of what we've done here in Colorado. If you go to the next slide, please. Just a couple of highlights. This past year, we did officially implement universal preschool, 10 hours of free preschool across the state of Colorado. It is a true kind of mixed delivery model. We've worked very hard to make sure that this universal preschool model works very well for working families. And it includes, for example, the option to utilize community-based providers as well as family child care homes. And is not directly administered through school districts, but rather it will be administered through a brand new cabinet level Department of Early Childhood here in Colorado. We work directly on capital grants and thinking about how we can leverage public-private partnerships here in Colorado. So we've created new capital grant programs for new and expanding childcare businesses, which includes grants to family childcare homes. We had some landmark legislation this year that also included funding for FFN care providers here in Colorado, recognizing that they're a critical part of our care system. And we've also established a brand new public-private partnership office here in Colorado. Our governor has issued a requirement to reduce the footprint of square footage that the state government uses by 1 million square feet. And they're also inventorying all of their real estate to look at opportunities to leverage state-owned, tax-free real estate that could be utilized by community-based childcare providers and operators. We've also put some new tax credits and exemptions into place here in Colorado. We just passed a new tax exemption bill exempting nonprofit childcare facilities from any sort of commercial property taxes, and also have a childcare contribution tax credit here in Colorado, which allows for a 50% tax credit on any contributions up to $200,000. We've also addressed some regulatory barriers. We heard from family childcare homes that oftentimes homeowners associations were not allowing them to provide childcare in their homes due to bylaws that they had created around that. And we also heard that oftentimes zoning and building code issues were coming up and creating some pretty significant barriers to entry. So we've also addressed those. And lastly, we created an employer-based childcare grant program and design lab. So this next slide will just kind of show you, we heard directly from employers here in Colorado. We want to help address the supply. And oftentimes employers that do have employees that need to report to a specific location are interested in creating on-site or near-site childcare, either themselves or in partnership with other employers, but they didn't know how. And so we created a design lab this past year that actually helped guide them through that entire process of how you think about this, create the business model, do the pro forma financial modeling, think about the regulation and finding a good operations partner. And as a result of that lab, we now expect about 495 new childcare spots to be created, with about 275 of those for infants and toddlers. And we have a grant program that those employers can access through the state to also help support those costs that come with it. So I also want to note that these are largely projects based in rural, frontier, and resort regions of Colorado, not in metro areas. And many of them are partnerships. So yeah, lots of great stuff going on. I am now going to turn it back over to Miriam to facilitate our Q&A.
Thank you so much, Nicole and Julie and Gina and Mary. That was absolutely terrific. I'm struck as I'm, hearing all of you present, Julie and Gina, such important, I think, grounding in the fact that we have policy, we have the policy solutions to this challenge. We have evidence, we have legislation that we could advance, to that tomorrow, right? To bring forward sort of these solutions. And then, Mary and Nicole, I think your points and kind of really reminding us around, how important it is to center the voices of those who are most impacted, to bring new voices into this work. I think Nicole, particularly business leaders who we know can be really influential and important, I think, in this effort. And Mary, I think, how important it is to have the context and to realize this is ultimately about shifting power and creating that kind of will to act that are going to get these solutions over the line. So, all right, I'm going to take sort of a moderator's privilege and ask a couple of questions of all of you, and then we will hear and take some questions from the audience. So to start, some of the speakers on the first panel talked about, the first panel touched on COVID. Several of you have also kind of brought up and mentioned the impact of COVID relief in reshaping the subsidy system and childcare markets in states. I'm hoping each of you could sort of reflect on the lessons learned from both the pandemic, I think, and the subsequent federal and state efforts to sort of stabilize the industry. What are we seeing? What are we learning? What are bright spots?
I can jump in if that's to start this off. The first thing the pandemic did is it showed everybody what those of us in the childcare field knew, right? Which is this was a system with massive cracks, and the pandemic, just to continue the metaphor too far, broke the foundation, right? It just broke it apart. So on the one hand, it proved that, and we are now seeing the impact of that as staff are saying, why should I do this job when I can get more at Walmart and benefits? And the second thing is, I think that related to the pandemic, also separate, was the increased focus on equity and racial justice, which coincided. And I think those two lenses together showed us what's going on in this field. The pandemic relief money was phenomenal. It's done really good things. If people did things like you're going to pay for enrollment rather than attendance, because private paying parents pay on, they pay for the whole month. They don't pay just the days that their kid goes, right? So the provider can count on that. They did things like giving providers grants. They did things like giving providers money to help pay for all those additional costs for PPE or for staff, compensation. The problem is that money's going away. So, to be developing long-term sustained change has been very challenging with that. Some states went ahead and said, I'm going to do it anyway, and I'm going to just believe and trust that the money will come. Other states said, I'm not going to do it. If I have to expand services now and then cut it back next 2 years from now, I'm not going to go there. So I think it just, not to be a broken record, it just takes me back right to where I was a few minutes ago, which is it was an incredibly important infusion. I think there's great lessons to be learned, but it was a big thumb in the dike, right? It was really valuable, but it can't fix those larger issues unless that's sustained. There are a few states that really thought, I'm going to think about how do I rethink my system? Like we just finished some very interesting work in Georgia, a colleague was running, where, they really let's do stakeholder engagement. Let's talk to parents, let's talk to providers, let's talk to caseworkers, let's talk to everybody and figure out what the problems are, how do we fix them? But to really fix those things, there's going to need to be more money coming in to really address them in the future. So that would be my COVID 101.
Yeah. Certainly, I was going to say from the business perspective, I believe that employers now have realized that they must be a part of this solution, and that, part of the role of being an employer, part of being in the private sector, being dependent on this workforce, is making sure that you play your role in advocating for and and to some degree financially supporting the childcare needs of your workforce in your community, whether that's through your corporate social responsibility and supporting it at large, or providing better benefits and stipends and on-site childcare, or advocating for it through policies and other work with chambers or otherwise. Everyone plays a role, and we really try to motivate and inspire our business leaders to do that.
And I would add from a parent perspective, after the doctors and nurses were, the key essential workforce, everyone else were really low paid workers, particularly from communities of color. They were the janitors, they were the grocery workers, they were the agricultural workers, they were working in, as home health aides or in nursing homes. And so, if those workers were essential during the pandemic, they were essential before, during, and after. And I think we were able to create an essential worker childcare voucher program. And for a lot of those families, Micaela, who the picture, who's there with her son, she was able to get a childcare voucher as an essential worker. She was also pursuing 2 master's degrees and working as an Uber Eats driver at night, and had a 1-year-old, and was missing putting him to bed at night. And so once she got that subsidy, she was able to quit that job, focus on school, focus on her essential work. But as Gina mentioned, that money is running out, and so without that next round of funding, I don't know what's going to happen. And then along with that, being able to waive the co-payments, which became a policy under COVID. We thought it was going to be really radical to ask for that, but then COVID happened, and it gave us the opportunity. And now we're each year fighting to keep those waived, but we really need that to be permanent so that we can focus on other things.
I think everyone said it really well. I'll just add a few quick thoughts that, one is, I think that the COVID relief funding does show us that when the public sector gets involved and invests, it matters and it makes a difference, right? And that market failure, that we heard from economists earlier, that, parents can't pay it on their own, and the early educators, the women of color are doing this job, the, women all over doing this job, like, they could be paid more if we put public investment in, and we can both lower costs for families and raise wages for early educators at the same time with public dollars, which has been, the vision and the plan. And so I think the fact that it worked and can work and, demonstrated that matters a lot. And then at the same time, and I put a report in the chat that showed that, at least about 3 million childcare spots were saved by that, right? And that's a combination of supporting the families and supporting the early educators and providers. I think Gina's point about the shaky foundation that we started on, I think a lot of us are really worried the foundation is so broken that even all of the building we were able to do with the funding is not enough. And in fact, that, if that funding is allowed to run out, we may be in worse shape than we were before for the childcare sector, for parents, for children. And, that is heartbreaking, particularly in a moment when right-wing judges are taking away, access to abortion. It was always a problem. We always need access to abortion and childcare. And this is just a really terrifying moment, even more so if this childcare support goes away.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I think it is so much feels at huge stake right now, as we know that, as a result of some of this of COVID funding coming into this sector, we've seen, really some dream subsidy policies in terms of making more families eligible, waiving co-pays, subsidizing many more providers than have ever been able to receive public funding in ways that they've been able to raise wages, improve working conditions. And there's just so much at stake here as we think about these funds going away with no longer term solution, and what is actually going to be felt by families and providers and children. So I think that's a good maybe segue into the sort of next question I want to ask all of you, which is, we've been talking about, a variety of solutions some of which are shorter term and others are more aspirational or longer term. I wonder if each of you could share your thought on what needs to happen next to ensure that parents have access to the care that meets their needs, that employers have access to the full range of talent in the labor market, and that childcare workers and providers can go from surviving to thriving. That's, an easy question. That's a softball.
I mean, it's an easy question because it's an easy solution. Like, I just need money. I mean, Gina said it. Like, we have all the solutions. We have all of the stakeholder feedback. We have all of the reports. We have all of the data. Like, I don't think we can do this anymore. It's just, we just need the money. And there's, we can't, professionally develop providers anymore, or, require them to do any more training. Like, they know what they're doing. They just need to be paid, and I think the other piece is that when we're putting forth policy solutions, it's like, how do we do that in concert with the needs of parents and the needs of providers? Because we live in such a scarcity mindset, we're often told we have to choose. Well, if you want to increase the wages for providers, then we can't do additional slots. Or if we're going to, waive co-payments, then we can't do this. And it's like, no, they all go hand in hand. It's an ecosystem and it's interdependent. And when both the parent and the caregiver's needs are met, the outcomes for children are going to be amazing. And so I just feel like we have to get more organized and succinct about talking about money, and that none of this is going to get done without it.
Can I just build on that for a second? I think one of the things that I think is really important about what Mary's saying is that I think over the last 15 years, we've increasingly moved to kind of a professional vision of what childcare is. It's become very focused on the system and the programs. And I think we've lost track of the parents and the providers a bit. And this is where I think the move in our subsidy system towards center-based care, despite the fact that it is a work support as well as a child development support. And we have massive numbers of people of color and families with low incomes who are working non-traditional hours. And in the small study that we did, said that if it's bedtime and sleeping, they'd rather have their kids at home in their own beds with somebody they know watching them, which is the one kind of care that we basically do not support in the subsidy system. That system is doing a great job with the resources it has to serve a certain part of the problem. But I think we need to have a bigger vision of what problem we're trying to solve that's based on what parents want and need and what providers want and need. And I feel like we have to get back to that, because right now I think we're focusing, understandably with the pandemic, on we have to rescue what we have, right? We have to rescue providers, we have to keep things from dying. But we also, I think, have an opportunity to try to reshape and really make sure that we're centering this on what families need, what children need, what providers need, and think a little bit out of our box. So I'm hoping that if we can get resources, that we use them in a way that frames it, basing it on what Mary was talking about, which is what works for people and what do they want and need.
And of course, ditto to both of those. And I'll just add on to it that, ultimately, we also need to build power, because what happens is when Black women, when Latino women, when Indigenous women, when we do not have access to childcare, we've seen what that does to labor force participation. We've seen what that does to helping support children to thrive. And so it actually keeps people back, and it's intentional. And, as Mary kind of talked through the history, right? And so if we actually invest in these things, then we are able to build more power, build more resources, build more wealth. And that actually allows us to build greater support for the future and for more money. I think that it helps us to shift from a scarcity mindset where it's you can only have childcare, you can't also have paid leave, to an abundant mindset where we can actually imagine what is possible if we had the power and resources to make it possible. So I think it's important to think about that too.
I will say, one of the things we've been working on is really trying to demystify the childcare business model a little bit. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this, some sort of variation of the comment of like, well, with the amount of money I'm paying for childcare, I'm surprised the owner's not driving a Ferrari, right? Like, people just fundamentally don't understand how this business model actually works. And so we're actually about to release a report for Colorado here, which talks about, the fact that, like, for example, wages comprise anywhere from 50 to 70% of your expenses in a childcare business model typically, right? That 20% could be rent and commercial property taxes and debt service, right? And all of these different things that, if we were to address some of those ongoing fixed operational expenses, either for childcare centers or even family childcare homes, that we could make a significant difference in their business model and what that actually looks like from a revenue and expense equation. So we're also trying to tackle some of those pieces to say, hey, like, if we've got someone paying over $100,000 a year in commercial property taxes, what would happen if they didn't have to pay that bill and they could put that towards compensation for their teachers, or they could put that towards lower costs for parents. So really trying to think about longer term, like Gina said, right, solutions that we can think about for the longer term here too, that aren't just about, okay, we've gotten some immediate relief from these, federal stimulus funds, but we're going to need to think about this for years on end moving forward.
Great, thank you all so much for that. It was great. So we're going to shift to a question from the audience now. This question, so curious if folks have experience with this and seen any kind of models. So the question is asking about what would it take to restructure required licensing in K-12 and early childhood to allow for on-the-job training? So it is a workforce solution.
I'm sorry, on-the-job training for the licensors or for?
I think for early childhood, for childcare staff.
I don't think that's a licensing restructuring question.
Right. I think it's probably referencing K-12 maybe license.
Okay, then I can't speak to that. Sorry.
Is that right? And if we didn't get that question right, that's how I'm interpreting it. To what would it take to restructure licensing in K-12 and early childhood, so we could grow support on the job training, so that more childcare, I think, staff and professionals could work in K-12 settings and have their training count.
I don't know if I can answer that completely, but what I can say is from our experience in what's been happening over the last couple of years in California, with a push to serve more 4-year-olds in the K-12 system, there have been, some law changes to reduce classroom ratios in the school-based settings because they were way too high to serve 4-year-olds. However, what I would say though is that, and I don't think this is what the question was getting at, but this is just more of a commentary on the interactions between early childhood education and K-12 systems, is that, we should not be pushing the K-12 system down to ECE. We should be pushing ECE up to K-12, like the social emotional development and small ratios and things like that. And what we've seen with this sort of shift to school-based settings and K-12 public school settings as the place to serve 4-year-olds, now we're seeing a lot of ECE providers who have the degrees and possibly the credentials leave the ECE field and move to the school-based setting because pay, benefits, union, all of the things are set up for them. And that is definitely destabilizing our early care system. And I think there's just this idea that, well, all of a sudden you'll have these empty classrooms and now you can serve 3-year-olds and 2-year-olds and babies. And it's just so easy to adapt. And, you taught 4-year-olds, obviously you can treat babies. And it's just a lot of assumptions that are really undermining really both systems, because neither can really address this alone.
Absolutely, Mary. Thanks for that. I mean, I think this question could really be getting at either like sort of educator licensing, or just sort of the differences around, requirements. I think is what as you're talking about across the different settings in mixed delivery systems. So I think it's a great question. Maybe we can get some more follow up around. In response to the panel. So I think we have maybe time for maybe one or two more questions if we can sort of do this really quickly. So Julie, I want to come to you and really ask you about what's next for the child tax credit. What are you thinking in terms of opportunities to pursue in states? But I'd love to hear what's next for a child tax credit.
Yeah, I think that, we saw during the pandemic relief, what a big difference it made for families, that families were able to pay for, whether it was school supplies, the roof over their heads, food, all the necessities of life, as well as, mental health support for teens, right? At this moment where the pandemic was incredibly challenging for so many families. And so I think we, got even more evidence that this makes a difference. I want to just be really clear that child tax credit is something that is needed in addition to investments in childcare. That's the child tax credit is not a childcare solution, although it could be used toward a piece of it, but you're not going to be able to pay providers better. You're not going to be able to build the system that parents and providers need and children need, quite frankly. And so, states already have CTCs, some are building on them. I think the idea of refundability is very important, that you get it even if you don't have tax liability, which means that those who are lower income are able to actually get the child tax credit. I think the model of getting it out to people proactively without having to file taxes and on a monthly basis, that made a huge difference, right? And it was just such a seamless and easily accessible program where the government actually used existing data that they had to get money to people's, into people's homes and into their wallets. And so I think there's so many great lessons learned. I think one thing to be aware of is wolves in sheep's clothing. I think there are a lot of folks who are claiming to be family supporters right now, putting out proposals. I think that if they are coming from people who also do not think that people who can get pregnant should control when they get pregnant, and when they have a baby or start a family, or whether they start a family, then you probably want to take another look and see whether their policy is the real deal, or if it's just about continuing to control power and resources. So I think we need to be very thoughtful about the policies that we're supporting, and the ones that we've already seen that went into effect during the pandemic are the kinds of policies we should be fighting for.
Thank you so much, Julie. Well, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank all of you for your contributions. I think I heard, Julie laid out the CARE agenda, and for childcare, it's about resources, and we need to get busy doing it. We have to center providers and families in the solutions and the implementation, and we've got to build more power. So we can and will to act, so we can get these changes to happen and be real for more children and families and providers and communities. So thanks again, all of you, for your contributions. This was really great. I am going to kick it back over to Elizabeth to close this out.
Thanks so much. I will just echo Miriam's thanks. I want to thank all of our panelists and all of you, and also extend a special thank you to folks who are probably not listening in, who are taking care of kids. I suspect that there are more than one of us who are on this panel or who've been engaging all afternoon, thanks to a childcare provider making it possible for us to focus and have this conversation. So just acknowledging that it's something I think about every day, and it's part of why I was so looking forward to this conversation. I'm so glad to be working with all of you moving forward. So we will share a recording of the speaker heads in the comments. I think it's a link to our website, workrisenetwork.org is where you can find everything. And we had lots of questions for the audience that we didn't get to. We will do our best to follow up with some of those, so stay tuned. And really a thank you to all of you in the audience and panelists alike. Have a really wonderful day and come back soon.